The notification arrived on a Tuesday, and Mara Chen read it 3 times before she let herself believe it. Galactic Academy of Advanced Sciences and Engineering. Acceptance Cohort 7, Track, Stellar Navigation and Advanced Propulsion. Candidate, CHEN, MARAYLING, Earth Sol III. She was sitting in the back of her father's workshop when she read it. The workshop smelled like machine oil and the particular burnt metal tang of the soldering iron he ran all day, 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. He repaired things. Boots, mostly, the heavy magnetic-soled kind that station workers wore on the orbital platforms, the kind that cost 4 months' wages to replace and 3 days to mend. He bent over them at his bench with a magnifying visor and hands that should have belonged to a surgeon, and he fixed them, and when they were fixed, he charged less than anyone else in the settlement, and Mara had grown up watching those hands and thinking, that is what precision looks like. That is what caring looks like. She didn't tell him right away. She sat with the message for a long moment, feeling the weight of it the way you feel the weight of something that is about to change everything, and she looked at his hands moving under the work lamp, and she thought of the night 12 years ago when she was 7 years old, and the colony's main projector had broadcast the footage. A hegemony cruiser exiting jump space above the station, engines cycling down, a light show of violet fire that painted the whole viewport blue and white. She had pressed her nose to the glass and watched, and felt something lock into place inside her chest like a bolt sliding home. She wanted to go there. She wanted to go up and out and away to the place where the ships came from. Her father looked up from the bench. He had eyes like hers, dark, steady, patient, and he read her face the way he read a cracked soul, methodically and without drama. "What?" he said. She turned the screen toward him. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he put down the iron and crossed the room and put his arms around her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The Academy was on Veth Prime, a mid-gravity world with yellow-green skies and air that tasted faintly of copper. It took Mara 6 months of saved passage fees and one very humbling loan to get there. And when she stepped off the transport into the arrivals hall, she was immediately the smallest thing in a room full of beings who were not small. The Keth were there in clusters, their elongated limbs folded like praying mantises at rest, their communicators translating in the soft harmonic rumble that passed for speech in their culture. The Davorians stood in pairs, bilateral symmetry but 3 times Mara's mass, their skin a deep iridescent blue that she would later learn indicated youth and health. There were Sen, small, nimble, with 4 eyes and the kind of sharp social intelligence that made them natural navigators. And there were Valori, whose homeworld had the least geological activity in the known hegemony, and who consequently had the most delicate nervous systems and the most elaborate social hierarchies to compensate. And there was Mara Chen, 5'4", carrying a duffel bag that contained everything she owned, from the working-class orbital settlement of New Tangshan, Sol III, also known in the galactic taxonomy as Earth, the Deathworld. She had been told before she left that people would have feelings about that. She had been told it might be uncomfortable. She had nodded and said she understood, and she had understood in the abstract, the way you understand a thing from books and screens. She had not understood it, yet in the way you understand a thing when a Keth student in the housing assignment queue turns and looks at you, and takes 2 deliberate steps sideways to put distance between you, as if proximity to Earth-born biology might be contagious. She understood it better after that. Her roommate was a Sen named Ori, who came from the 3rd moon of a gas giant in the Orland system, and had the good sense to be curious rather than afraid. "Earth," Ori said, on the first night, the 4 eyes cycling between wide and narrow in what Mara had already learned to read as fascinated thought. "Your gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared." "Yes." "Our homeworld is 4.1. "I know. You walk around in 9.8. It's all I've ever known. Ori was quiet for a moment, working through the physics of that. Our athletes, she finally said, the ones who train for competitions, they use gravity augmentation suits set to 6.2. It destroys their joints after a decade. My father wore the same pair of boots for 17 years, Mara said. He resoled them himself, twice. Ori looked at her feet. I'm not going to break anything, Mara said, which was not entirely true, but which was true enough for the first night in a new world. The first weeks of the program were called orientation phase, which was the Academy's elegant term for the process of discovering who you were and where you fit in the hierarchy of beings. It was run by Instructor Vate, a Davorian of the old school, formal, exacting, and possessed of the particular condescension that belongs to those who have spent their entire careers surrounded by the best of the best and have consequently forgotten what ordinary effort looks like. He was not unkind. Mara would say that clearly later when she thought about it. He was not unkind. He simply could not see her. She was a small thing from a high-gravity world, and the high gravity explained her density and her musculature and the way she moved, and it explained nothing about whether she could do the actual work of stellar navigation and advanced propulsion. But he had made up his mind in the first week, and the math of first impressions is stubborn. He called her Ms. Chen in the tone of voice that means, I acknowledge your presence in this room and wish to acknowledge nothing else. He called Breath, the top-ranked Keth student, by his given name. He called Pelin, the Valori whose family had funded 3 academy buildings, Pelin. He looked at Mara's first computational navigation exercise. She'd scored 94 and said, solid for someone with no prior exposure to hegemony standard coordinate systems, which was technically a compliment and was not received as one. The other students noticed this. Most of them had the grace to notice it privately. A few did not. There were 4 of them, initially. Not a formal group, just a clustering of the kind of students who have always existed in institutions of learning, who mistake the confidence bred by privilege for intelligence and have not yet been tested enough to know the difference. Breath was the leader in the way that someone becomes a leader when they're simply the largest and the loudest. Pelin was there because Pelin was always where the social power was. The other 2 were Sen named Turek and Asa, and they followed because following is easier than thinking. They didn't start badly. It was just comments, the kind that sit right on the line between observation and insult so that when you object to them you sound sensitive, and when you don't object to them you understand exactly what they were designed to make you feel. The Earth Girl managed the pressure simulation. Remarkable endurance for a primitive nervous system. I'd heard humans were adaptable. I thought that was overstated. Mara heard them. She had excellent hearing. She had been tested once during intake medicals and the audiologist had looked at the results and said, this is unusual, and Mara had said, high gravity, dense atmosphere. Everything about our sensory systems calibrated up, and the audiologist had said, and written something in the chart. She heard them and she did not respond, and she turned back to her work. This was interpreted incorrectly as weakness. The first real incident happened in the propulsion lab. It was a standard exercise. Calibrate a thrust array to within 2% tolerance, which was routine for anyone with strong numeracy and fine motor control. The array was mounted on a platform designed for Davorian reach, meaning it was calibrated for a comfortable working height of roughly 2.2 meters, which put the upper controls at Mara's full reach if she stood on her toes. She was working through it methodically, the way her father had taught her to work through anything mechanical. Start at the anchors, move to the moving parts, trust the math. When Breath appeared at the adjacent station and reached across her workspace to adjust a control she hadn't gotten to yet. I've already run that sequence, he said, not looking at her. You'll want to start from the primary coupling. I started from the primary coupling, Mara said. Your coupling reads as misaligned. She checked, the coupling was fine. She said nothing. You should realign it before you continue, Breath said. The voice was smooth, helpful, impossible to argue with in front of an instructor. Earth standard manual calibration might not interface correctly with hegemony spec hardware. Instructor Vate passing paused, looked at the readout, looked at Mara. He may have a point, Ms. Chen. The tolerances here are. Within spec, Mara said. I checked twice. There was a pause, the kind of pause that says, we are determining whether this is confidence or insolence. Continue, Vate said, and moved on, and Mara continued. The array came in at 1.7% tolerance. Breaths came in at 2.4%, which was technically passing and technically worse, and nothing was said about either one. Ori noticed. He sabotages the ones he thinks might outrank him, she told Mara that evening in their room, eating reconstituted noodles that tasted nothing like noodles but were warm and familiar enough to count. He did it to a Keth student in last year's cohort. The student transferred to orbital mechanics. I know, Mara said. So you'll file a report. Mara thought about her father's hands, working the iron across the sole of someone's boot. The patience of it, the lack of drama, the absolute certainty that the boot would eventually be what it was supposed to be. No, she said. Why not? Because I'm going to outrank him through the coursework, and that will be clearer than a report. Ori was quiet for a moment. That's a very human answer, she said, and Mara couldn't tell whether she meant it admirably. The thing about being from Earth, and this was something the galactic community had processed intellectually without ever quite internalizing emotionally, was that the word Deathworld covered a range of realities that the label did not fully communicate. Yes, Earth's gravity was high. Yes, Earth's atmosphere, while breathable, carried particulate counts and microbial populations that kept an alien immune system busy. Yes, the surface temperature swings between regions were dramatic, the weather systems were violent by hegemony averages, and the evolutionary history of the dominant species, humanity, had been shaped by predators, ice ages, plagues, seismic events, volcanic winters, and a few extinction-level incidents that humanity had survived through a combination of luck and the particular stubbornness that high-mortality environments breed into whatever stays alive long enough to reproduce. But the Deathworld label implied to most galactic citizens that humans were tough in the way a rock is tough, dense, durable, and not particularly interesting once you accepted the density. It did not communicate what high-gravity, high-stakes evolution actually produces when it runs for 3 million years. It did not communicate the nervous system that remains functional under loads that would cause most species systems to shut down entirely. It did not communicate the bone density, the cardiovascular reserve, the immune system that had spent millennia learning to fight without flinching, the thermoregulation that let the body continue operating in temperature ranges that would kill a Davorian in minutes. And it did not communicate the patience. The particular human patience that comes from a species that spent most of its history waiting for seasons to turn, waiting for prey to exhaust, waiting for wounds to close and bodies to heal and luck to shift. Humans, in the ecological record, were persistence hunters. They didn't catch things by being faster. They caught things by being willing to keep going long after everything else had stopped. Mara was thinking about none of this when she sat down in Instructor Vate's assessment review meeting. She was thinking about the navigation simulation she'd scored second highest on, and whether she'd correctly interpolated the jump point variance calculation, and whether the error in her last propulsion assignment was a rounding issue or a conceptual one. Vate sat across from her with the academic precision of someone who had given this same talk 800 times, and had stopped noticing that the person across from him was a person. You're performing adequately, he said. I scored 97 on the navigation simulation, Mara said. Yes, the calculations were correct. The methodology was non-standard. The result was correct. The methodology matters, Ms. Chen. In the field, when you are navigating under hegemony standard protocols, non-standard methodology introduces error points. My methodology produced a result within 0.03% of optimum. Vate looked at her with the expression of a man who has heard an objection before and has an answer ready. Breath's result was within 0.01% using standard methodology. The gap is small now. In actual stellar navigation, that gap becomes larger. Myra said, I know. I'll work on the methodology. I've seen students from non-standard educational backgrounds before, Vate said, and his tone was not unkind, it was just finished, concluded. The verdict given before the evidence was fully heard. They often reach a ceiling in the second phase. The theoretical load increases significantly. He was not wrong about other students. He was wrong about her, but he did not know that yet, and she saw in his face that he would not be easily convinced by argument. She would have to be convinced by results. Thank you, she said, and stood and went back to work. The first Galactic Culture class met on a Wednesday morning with Instructor Daveline, a Sen of the academic subtype, meaning a Sen who had spent so long in institutions that the usual Sen's social sharpness had been partially replaced by a genuine, almost touching faith that information would solve everything. She was small even by Sen standards, with the fourth eye slightly milky, which Ori said meant age and was considered distinguished rather than diminishing, and she ran the class with enthusiastic precision. The topic in week 3 was Deathworld ecology. Specifically, why certain planets produced organisms that were, by hegemony biological standards, alarming. The classification systems are important, Instructor Daveline said, projecting a hegemony standard planetary survey chart. Students should understand that Deathworld is a functional designation rather than a pejorative one. It simply indicates planets where local conditions, atmospheric density, gravitational profile, microbial competition, temperature variance, and predation pressure have pushed evolution toward robustness rather than efficiency. Mara was in the second row. She had her notes open. She wrote, robustness rather than efficiency. The evolutionary pressure on high gravity, high competition worlds tends to produce organisms with redundant systems, Daveline continued. Multiple redundant organ systems, elevated pain tolerance, immune systems calibrated to fight constant microbial challenge, circulatory and musculoskeletal systems designed to function under loads that would cause tissue breakdown in organisms from gentler worlds. The result is organisms that are, in a pure survival stress sense, difficult to damage. From the back of the room, in the particular carrying way that Breath had learned to project his voice without appearing to address anyone, there was a murmured aside. And to educate. Myra did not look up from her notes. Daveline continued, unaware or choosing to be. Earth is one of the more well-documented cases in this category. Sol III has an active geological environment, a thin but turbulent atmosphere, significant predation history, temperature extremes across latitude, and roughly 3.5 billion years of constant evolutionary pressure. The dominant intelligent species that emerged from this environment is, from a strictly biological perspective, one of the most structurally robust sapient species in the current hegemony census. A hand went up near the back. Breath, who rarely raised his hand because he had learned to just speak, was raising his hand. Daveline called on him. I've seen the biological profiles, Breath said. The raw physical robustness is interesting, but surely the trade-off is cognitive. High-resource environments produce more complex neural architectures. Earth's nervous system, by the profile data, uses a relatively primitive threat-response model. Daveline turned her fourth eye toward Mara briefly, in the Sen way of checking whether someone wants to respond. Mara made a small gesture. Go ahead. The neural architecture question is more nuanced than the profiles suggest, Daveline said. The human threat response system is indeed fast and resource-intensive. It evolved to handle immediate physical danger. What's less commonly noted is the degree to which this same system, when directed toward abstract problems, produces a particular kind of focused persistence that other neural architectures don't naturally replicate. In competitive intelligence assessments, humans don't typically outperform Keth in raw processing speed. They tend to outlast them in endurance conditions. Outlast, Breath said, as if the word were mildly amusing. Outlast, Daveline confirmed. The functional advantage is duration rather than speed, a persistence-hunting adaptation repurposed for intellectual work, when the problem requires sustained effort over time rather than a rapid optimal solution. Human cognitive endurance is a meaningful advantage. Breath said nothing. In the silence, Turek looked at Asa, and Asa looked at the table. Mara wrote in her notes, duration rather than speed. She underlined it once and moved on. She called her father every 11 days, which was the interval that worked across the time difference and his work schedule. He always answered covered in the faint residue of his work, a smear of polymer sealant on the back of one hand, the magnifying visor pushed up onto his forehead like a second pair of eyes. He asked about her coursework with the focused attention he gave to a complicated repair job, wanting to understand not just whether it was going well but how. The jump point calculation, she said, one evening in the 4th month. You have to account for gravitational lensing from nearby mass. The standard formula uses a table of correction coefficients, but I worked out that you can derive them on the fly with. Show me, he said, which was what he always said, and she held up the screen and walked him through it, and he watched with those patient eyes and the particular expression she had known since childhood, the one that meant, I am seeing something I didn't know before, and I am glad. At the end, he said, the table is faster. The table is faster if you have it, she said. If you don't have it, then you need to know the math underneath it, he said. Yes. He'd had no more education than anyone in the settlement. He had learned the work by doing the work, and what he knew to the bottom of it, in the way you can only know things you've had to derive for yourself because nobody handed you a manual. And watching him on the screen, his face lit blue-white by the shop light behind him, Mara felt something that she couldn't name, not homesickness, exactly, but something related to it, something about the particular texture of love for a person who taught you without meaning to teach, who showed you the shape of how to work by simply working. You're going to be all right, he said, which was what he said at the end of every call, which was not a prediction but a faith, the way certain people make faith out of the simplest declarative sentences. I know, she said. There was a study room on the 3rd floor of the residence building that nobody claimed between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning, because most of the cohort species had sleep requirements that made those hours impractical. The Keth were 4-stage sleepers who needed their longest stage between the hours of the 2nd and 5th bell late night, in the station's clock cycle. The Davorians were strict circadian adherents. The Sen were polyphasic in a pattern that left them refreshed by midnight and exhausted again by 2. Mara was a human, which meant her sleep architecture was an evolved compromise between the need to be aware of night predators and the need to actually sleep, and the result was a pattern that her fellow students found mildly unsettling. She could be awake and fully functional at any hour with approximately 40 minutes of lead time, could run on 6 hours without significant degradation, and could push to 22 hours of wakefulness in a high-stakes situation before she would describe herself as impaired. She used the midnight to 4 window for the work that required concentration, the kind of thinking that was interrupted during daylight by lab schedules and social dynamics and Breath's voice carrying from across the corridor. She sat in the third-floor room with her materials spread across the table and she worked, and it was in these hours that she loved the program most purely. Not the competition, not the ranking, not the proving of anything to anyone, but the work itself. Navigation was, at its core, a problem of time and gravity. Every jump through fold space required a calculation. The mass concentrations in the region of exit, the drift of gravitational bodies during transit time, the accumulation of small errors over large distances that turned a correct calculation into a catastrophic one. It was the kind of problem that rewarded obsessiveness. It rewarded the willingness to run a calculation, 12 times looking for the approximation you'd allowed yourself to make at step 7. Mara ran calculations 12 times. She ran them 15 times. She ran them until the answer felt solid in a way that wasn't confidence, but was closer to recognition. The feeling of a thing that has been checked enough that you're not trusting the result, you're reading it. Ori found her there, one morning at 2:15, and sat across from her and ate a packet of something that smelled powerfully of fermented grain. "What are you working on?" Ori said. "The cluster navigation problem from next week's assignment. It's not due for 10 days. "I know." Ori ate more of the fermented thing. She had over the months stopped being surprised by what Mara did and had started being interested in it instead, which Mara appreciated as a significant upgrade. "Do you enjoy it?" Ori said. "Actually enjoy it, not just compelled to do it because of the program." Mara considered the question. "Yes," she said, "I think I'd do this even if no one was grading it. Even with Breath and Pellin and the rest." "The work isn't about them," Mara said. "They're in the periphery, the work is the work." Ori was quiet for a moment. "My people," she said, "have a concept I'm not sure there's a standard hegemony word for it. Orosal. It means something like, the part of you that continues when everything else stops, the thing that doesn't need a reason." Mara thought about that. She thought about a 7-year-old at a viewport. She thought about her father's hands, still moving after 17 years on the same bench. "We don't have a word for it either," she said. "But I think I know what it is." Ori made the 4-eyes cycling gesture that meant understanding. "I thought you might," she said, and ate the rest of her fermented packet, and they worked in companionable silence until the station clock rolled past 3, and the first SEND students began to appear in the corridor outside, beginning their morning phase. The escalation, when it came from Pellin. Pellin had a family and a name and a building on campus that bore that name, and Pellin had also, in Mara's estimation, a specific and carefully maintained anxiety about being outperformed by someone who didn't have those things. Pellin was good. She gave him that, genuinely capable, hard-working by the standards of someone who had always had the best instruction, technically proficient, and possessed of the kind of social intelligence that had evolved over millennia of competitive court hierarchy. The Valori were, at bottom, a species shaped by social competition rather than physical threat. Their predators had been other Valori, across generations of political maneuvering and resource control, and this had made them exquisitely sensitive to hierarchy and status in ways that humans found exhausting, and that Mara found straightforwardly readable. Pellin was afraid of her, not of her body, that would have been simpler and easier to address. Afraid of her work specifically, because her work was better than his more often than he'd expected, and he hadn't expected it at all. The thing he did was small, and it took a moment to be sure she hadn't imagined it. It was in the computational lab, a shared workspace with terminal access to the Academy's main navigation models. Mara had been running a simulation, a multi-jump route through a dense cluster, the kind of problem that required iterative approximation, and she'd stepped away for exactly 7 minutes to use the facilities and retrieve a food packet, and when she returned the simulation had been reset. Not crashed, not errored, reset cleanly to the beginning with none of her intermediate work saved. She stood in front of the terminal for a moment. She looked at the empty simulation space where 3 hours of work had been. She thought about filing a report. She thought about breath and the reports that hadn't been filed, and she thought about the pattern that was becoming clear. She sat down and started again. She got the simulation done in 4 hours this time, because she remembered the approach and didn't have to feel her way through the first stage twice. The result was better than the first run, because the second time through she caught an approximation she'd been sloppy with initially. She did not file a report. She saved the completed simulation to 3 separate locations, locked and time-stamped, and she sent a copy to Ori with a note that said, "Keep this." Ori looked at the note and then at the simulation file and then back at Mara. "They're going to keep doing this," she said. "I know. Eventually, they'll do something you can't just redo." "Maybe," Mara said, "but I'll deal with that when it happens." "Why not deal with it now, prevent it?" Mara thought about the question for a moment. She had learned about herself, a person who lived much in the future. She understood the future, could model it, could navigate toward it with precision. But she did not feel it the way she felt the present, the immediate problem on the terminal in front of her, the immediate solution she could work toward, the step she could take right now. This was, she supposed, a hunting thing. You could not catch something that wasn't there yet. You could only follow and wait and run until the thing stopped. "Because they'll run out before I do," she said, and she meant it, and she could not entirely explain why she was certain. The physical endurance test was not supposed to be a competition. Instructor Veit had framed it clearly. This was a baseline assessment for emergency procedures. The minimum standard was straightforward, and the purpose was qualification rather than ranking. Every student needed to pass. Nobody needed to excel. The test was a modified obstacle course, designed, like most academy infrastructure, for bodies somewhat larger than Mara's that simulated conditions aboard a damaged ship. Low oxygen atmosphere, variable gravity sections, physical manipulation of objects massing between 5 and 40 kilograms, navigation through spaces with compromised visibility. Standard stuff. It was pass-fail, graded at the minimum, and Mara had been told in her intake meeting that Earth-normal humans typically had no difficulty with the physical components. Breath decided, the morning of the test, that it was a competition. "First through wins nothing official," he said at breakfast loudly to the table at large. "But I thought it would be interesting to see the actual rankings since they're not being posted. I've talked to the monitors. They'll track the times." Mara ate her food and said nothing. Ori, across the table, caught her eye and made a gesture that meant, "Are you going to do anything?" Mara made a gesture back that meant, "Not at breakfast." The course began. Breath went first, as he'd arranged, and did well. His Keth physiology was designed for variable environments, his elongated limbs well suited to the manipulation stations, and he finished in a time that the monitors confirmed was excellent. He stood at the end of the course with the specific posture of someone who has done something and wants witnesses. Pelin went third and struggled with the gravity variation sections. Valori inner ear structure made variable G disorienting, but finished. Turek and Asa were quick in the low oxygen sections, Sen biology tolerating oxygen-poor air better than most. Mara was last to run, by her own choice. She'd asked to go last and hadn't explained why. She stood at the start gate and took 3 slow breaths, and felt the specific quality of the air in the room. Slightly richer than Earth standard, actually, which was interesting, and felt the gravity, which was 6.3, which her body simply read as light. She ran. She did not look dramatic when she ran. She never did. She had a Deathworld body moving through a world calibrated for something smaller and lighter, and she moved through it the way water moves through a space that was not designed for water, efficiently, finding every available line, not fighting the geometry but reading it. The low oxygen section was a non-event. She had grown up at altitude in the station's upper quadrants where her father's workshop was, and her blood carried oxygen the way a Davorian's body carried water. In deep reserves, she almost never needed to tap. The manipulation station she cleared in seconds, her hands her father's hands, she sometimes thought, because they had learned precision from his, calibrated to tolerances that the exercise didn't require. At the variable gravity section, where Pelin had faltered, she barely adjusted stride. She came through the end of the course and stopped and looked at the timer. The room was quiet for a moment. Instructor Vate was looking at something on his tablet. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Mara. She had beaten Breath's time by 3 minutes and 42 seconds. She had beaten every other time by more. The monitor confirmed it, and then confirmed it again, and Breath stood at the side of the room with his elongated limbs in the particular Keth posture that meant the exact equivalent of, "This is not how I expected this to go." Instructor Vate said nothing. Not right away. He wrote something on his tablet and Mara watched his face, and she watched the particular moment in which a man who has decided he knows the shape of something realizes the shape was wrong. It was a small moment. It moved through his expression like whether a shift, a pause, the recalibration of something that had been set and is now being reset. He looked up. "Well done, Ms. Chen," he said. Not well done for an Earth student. Not solid for someone with limited exposure. Just well done. It was the first time she had been spoken to exactly like everyone else, and she let herself feel that privately for exactly one moment. Then she picked up her pack and went to her next class. They escalated. Of course they did. Mara had known they would in the abstract way. She'd known the second jump on the navigation simulation would be better than the first, not from pessimism but from pattern recognition. Breath and Pelin and the two Sen had built a small social ecosystem around the belief that she was limited, and ecosystems resist revision. They do not give up a belief easily. They fight it. They find new evidence. They redefine the terms. What they tried next was also small, and also deniable, and also the kind of thing that is far more difficult to recover from than a reset simulation. The semester's major project was a collaborative navigation brief. A team exercise, 3 students, designing a jump route from a given origin point to a destination across a complex gravitational map. Mara had been assigned to a team with Breath and a quiet Davorian named Soth who was genuinely talented and had, as far as Mara could tell, no interest in the social hierarchies that consumed half the cohort's energy. Breath's contribution to the team dynamic was to document everything in ways that positioned his decisions as central and Mara's contributions as peripheral. The brief was collaborative, meaning the final document would be submitted jointly, but internal logs tracked who had worked on which section, and Breath, who had access to the team file first, had begun reattributing contributions in small ways. A calculation Mara had run appeared under his name. A route modification she'd proposed, accepted, and implemented was described in his draft as a team insight. Soth noticed before Mara did. Soth came to her quietly in the hall outside the navigation lab and said, "I need to show you something." She looked at what he showed her. She went through the log carefully because she wanted to be certain before she responded. She was certain. She went to Instructor Vate's office that evening and knocked on the frame of the open door. He looked up. He had been a long time looking at papers. There were the marks of concentration on his face, the particular fatigue of someone who takes their work seriously and therefore accumulates it in quantities that wear on them. He saw her and something in his expression shifted. She thought she recognized it now. A small guilt. The awareness of a scale that had not been balanced correctly. "Ms. Chen, I need to report something," she said. "I have documentation." She showed him the log. She showed him the original timestamps. She showed him the comparison between her submitted work files and the team brief, where the contributions had been quietly moved. Vate looked at the documentation for a long time. He was the kind of man who was genuinely good at his work and had simply made an error of categorization, had placed her in the wrong box, and then not looked at the evidence carefully enough to know the box was wrong. Looking at him now, Mara thought she could identify the specific point at which the recalibration was becoming complete. "How long has this been happening?" he said. "Variations of it since the second week," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't report it until now." "No." "Why?" She thought about how to explain it. "Because most of it I could counter by just doing better work. This one I couldn't because it wasn't about the work anymore. It was about the record of the work." Vate looked at the logs again. Then he looked at her in the particular way of someone who is updating something fundamental about the picture they hold. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for not seeing this sooner, and for certain things I said in your review meeting." "You don't need." "I do," he said with quiet Davorian formality. "I categorized you incorrectly, not maliciously but carelessly. That's my failure and I'll own it." Mara looked at him for a moment. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone actually changes their mind. Not the dramatic reversal, not the sudden proclamation of error, just this, the quiet settling of something that has been tilted into the correct position. "Thank you," she said and meant it. There is a simulation room on the 5th floor of the Academy's main tower that nobody likes to use, because the full immersion navigation model is physically uncomfortable, and often induces what the Sen called transit sickness, and what humans called vertigo, and what the Davorians had no word for because their bodies managed orientation differently. Most students ran partial immersion, which was less precise but far more comfortable. Mara ran full immersion. She had discovered, in the second month, that full immersion did not affect her the way it affected everyone else. Her inner ear, her vestibular system, the whole complex apparatus of spatial orientation that Earth's gravity and weather and three-dimensional vertical environment had spent millions of years calibrating. It processed the simulation data with a steadiness that the system designers had not anticipated when they'd built the room. Where a Davorian student would be disoriented, and an Sen student would need to stop and recalibrate every 20 minutes, Mara ran the simulation clean through, 3 hours at a stretch, and came out of it with good data and a faintly exhilarated feeling that she had not told anyone about because it seemed like bragging. The advanced navigation practical was scheduled for the last week of the second phase, full immersion, 4 hours. Students went one at a time, in a sequence drawn by lot, and the result was a scored navigation brief that would determine track placement for the third phase. Breath drew slot 2. He was in the room for 4 hours and 17 minutes, came out pale and visibly affected, and his result was excellent. Pellin drew slot 4. He requested a partial immersion dispensation on medical grounds, Valori vestibular sensitivity, which was granted, and his result was good. Mara drew slot 7. She went in at the beginning of the afternoon session, and she did not come out for 5 hours and 43 minutes, which was not because the simulation required it, but because at the 4-hour mark she had completed the assigned navigation brief and kept going, running additional scenarios because she was in the room and the room was comfortable and the work was interesting and she genuinely, deeply, unreservedly loved it. When she came out, the monitor said, "The system flagged the extended session. Are you all right?" "Fine," Mara said. "Could I get some water?" The monitor gave her water and the look of someone revising something. The result, when it was processed, was the highest score on the practical in 7 academy cohorts. Instructor Vate showed her the number and told her this, standing in his office with the expression of someone who no longer has a category for the thing they're looking at, and has decided this is not a problem but an opportunity to build a better category. "Track 1, he said. "First selection, you'll have your choice of specialization." She already knew what she would choose. She had known since she was 7 years old, nose against the viewport glass, watching engines cycle in the dark. Stellar navigation, she said. Long-range jump routing. The hardest specialization on the track. Yes. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, with a formality that the Davorians reserved for things they meant completely, "You're going to be exceptional, Ms. Chen." She didn't look away. "I know," she said, and she meant it the way her father always meant it, not as arrogance but as faith, the specific human faith that comes from having been tested enough times that you know, not as a wish but as a data point, that you don't stop. She called her father the evening after the results were posted. He looked tired. He had the tired look of someone who had worked a long week and was wearing it comfortably, the way people wear things they're used to. The magnifying visor was still on his forehead. There was boot polymer on his left hand, 2 fingers worth, and he hadn't bothered to wipe it off because the call had surprised him mid-job. "Track 1, she said. He didn't move for a moment, just looked at her. "First selection," she said. "Stellar navigation." He put down whatever was in his hand slowly, with the care he gave to things he did not want to drop, and his face did the thing it had done in the workshop the day the acceptance arrived, the still, full, entirely unperformed emotion of someone receiving something they had wanted and had not dared to entirely believe in. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She told him about the simulation and the scores and Vate's face and the track placement. She told him about Ori, who had celebrated by eating a truly unreasonable amount of reconstituted pastry, and then spent an hour teaching Mara a Sen coordination game that used all 4 hands simultaneously. She told him about Soth, the quiet Davorian who had shown her the log discrepancy, and who had, it turned out, grown up similarly overlooked in Davorian academic circles for reasons that were different in specifics and identical in shape. She told him about the 5th-floor simulation room, and how it didn't make her sick, and how she'd run an extra hour and 43 minutes just because she could. He listened. He listened the way he always listened to her, fully, with the kind of attention that doesn't plan its response while you're still talking. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "there's a boot on my bench right now. Magnetic sole, carbon mesh upper, owner says the coupling is broken, but it's not the coupling." He paused. "It's the secondary anchor point. 2 millimeters off, that's all. Everyone who looked at it before went straight to the coupling because the coupling is where those failures usually are. Missed it." "You saw it," Mara said. "I saw it," he said. "Took me 3 minutes, because I started from the beginning instead of from the assumption." She looked at him. She knew what he was telling her, and she knew he wasn't finished. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Every time. Don't let them start you from their assumptions." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I just like saying it." She laughed, and he laughed, and she held the screen like she used to hold his hand crossing the settlement concourse when she was small, and the 17 standard light minutes between them was nothing. It was just distance, and distance was a thing you navigated. 6 weeks before the end of the 2nd phase, there was an incident in the propulsion lab. Not a sabotage incident, not a social incident, a real one. A coolant line in the secondary propulsion bay ruptured, equipment failure, later attributed to a microfracture that had been missed in the last maintenance cycle, and the resulting reaction pushed the lab's internal temperature to 87 degrees Celsius in under 4 minutes. The automated safety systems triggered a lockdown, but the lockdown itself created a problem. Pellin and one of the Sen students, Asa, had been in the inner bay when the rupture occurred, and the lockdown sealed the inner bay's access door before they could get out. 87 degrees Celsius, sustainable for a Davorian for approximately 8 minutes before organ failure begins, for a Sen, rather less. The emergency response team was 6 minutes out. Mara was in the outer lab when it happened. She felt the temperature spike before the alarm sounded. felt it the way any organism calibrated to high-input environments develops sensitivity to rapid change. And she had the lab layout in her head because she had been in this room every day for months and had the kind of spatial memory that high-gravity navigating through complex station architecture develops whether you want it or not. She took the emergency access panel off the wall, not the main access door, which was sealed, but the maintenance panel that ran alongside the coolant line itself, a 30-centimeter crawl space designed for robotic inspection units, and she went in. Inside the panel was a temperature of 89 degrees and a set of physical access points to the secondary bay that were absolutely not rated for student use, and that Mara used anyway because she could hear Asa on the other side making the rapid clicking distress vocalization that Sen made when their temperature regulation was failing. It took 4 minutes and 17 seconds to get the inner bay's manual override disengaged. The override mechanism was designed for beings with Davorian hand proportions, which meant it was calibrated too large for Mara's hands to work correctly without modification, so she used the only tool available in the crawl space, the inspection robot's articulated arm, which she disconnected from its control housing and used manually, feeding cable by hand through a port that left parallel burn marks on her forearms from the proximity of the hot surface, and she got the door open. Pelin was at 41 degrees Celsius core temperature. Asa was at 43. The safe upper threshold for a Sen was 38. The emergency team arrived 2 minutes later and spent the first 30 seconds of their response dealing with the fact that the situation had already been resolved. Mara sat in the outer lab, in the part that had only reached 61 degrees during the incident, with burn marks on both forearms and a cup of water someone had handed her, and she thought about her father's hands, the parallel marks of the iron that he'd carried since before she was born, the occupational evidence of someone who worked close to heat because the work required it, and whose body had simply learned to accommodate this fact. The emergency medic examined her arms and said, "These are 2nd degree." "Yes," Mara said. "You should have." "I know," Mara said. "What's Asa's prognosis?" The medic told her. Asa would recover fully. Pelin would recover fully. The injuries were significant and would require treatment, but both students would return to coursework within the month. "You should have waited for the team," the medic said, not harshly. Genuinely, the way someone says a thing they believe when they also know it doesn't quite apply. "The team was 6 minutes out," Mara said. "Asa had maybe 4. The medic looked at the burns, looked at Mara, looked at the burns again with the expression of a being recalibrating a data set. "Deathworld," the medic said softly, not as an insult, as a fact being understood for the first time. "High gravity, dense atmosphere," Mara said, which was what she'd said to the audiologist, which was what she said whenever the explanation was needed. "Everything calibrates up." Pelin came to her room 3 days later. He stood in the doorway and Mara looked at him and said nothing and waited, which was something she was good at. "I wanted to thank you," he said. His voice had the precise quality of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was saying it precisely, which was the Valori way of being sincere. "I wanted to apologize also for the simulation and for the other things." Mara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the deleted simulation, the long hours of work that had to be done twice, the small, careful erosions that had been designed to make her question herself. "I know why you did it," she said. "That doesn't excuse it." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." "I was afraid of you," he said, with the directness of someone who has decided honesty is less painful than its alternative. "Not of you personally, of the disruption, of not being what I'd always been told I was in a room where you existed." Mara thought about that, about being the disruption simply by being present and being good at the work, about the particular exhaustion of having to be excellent not because excellence was its own goal, but because excellence was the only language that the people who had already decided your verdict could not find a way to ignore. "I'm going to keep being good at the work," she said. "That's not going to change." "I know," Pelin said. "I'm going to try to be better at dealing with that." He paused. "I'm not asking for, I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say it clearly." "I heard you," Mara said. He left, and Ori, who had been very carefully not watching from her side of the room, said, "Well." "Well," Mara agreed. "That was almost impressive." "He's scared of being wrong more than he's scared of me," Mara said. "That's something." "Is it enough?" Mara thought about it. "For now," she said. The semester-end ceremony was not a dramatic event. The academy did not go in for drama, which Mara had come to appreciate. There was a formal document, distributed by the registrar, with track placements and specialization assignments, and the ranking that had been the invisible subtext of 7 months' worth of work. There was a brief address from the dean. There was food after, which was the best part, because the catering for the end-of-semester function was the best food served anywhere in the academy, and Mara had learned early in the semester that the Valori imported something that tasted almost exactly like the hand-rolled noodles her father made, and she planned to eat a substantial quantity of them. She was standing near the function room's main viewport when Instructor Vate appeared at her shoulder. They stood for a moment looking out at the yellow-green sky of Veth Prime, the long amber light of the system's star catching the upper edge of the cloud layer and turning it briefly to copper and rose. "Your father makes shoes," Vate said. Mara turned, slightly surprised. "He repairs them." "Magnetic-soled work boots." "I read your file," Vate said, "after the review, more carefully than I had the first time." He paused. "He sent a letter, your father, when you were accepted, to the admissions committee." Mara was quiet for a moment. She had not known this. "It was unusual," Vate said. "Most letters of recommendation are about the student's academic record, about test scores and teacher evaluations. His letter was about a pair of boots." He glanced at her. "He said there was a pair of boots he'd repaired 14 times for the same customer. Not because the customer was careless, but because the customer worked harder than the boots were designed for. He said the boots were not made for the work that was being asked of them, and he had spent 14 years making them adequate to it anyway, and he said his daughter was the same. She was going somewhere she hadn't been built for, into conditions that would be harder than whatever she'd trained in, and she would figure it out the way she figured out everything, which was by refusing to stop." Mara looked out at the sky. The copper light was fading now, the cloud layer shifting to a deeper purple that was not quite like anything on Earth, but was beautiful in its own particular way. "I didn't know he wrote that," she said. "I should have read it more carefully the first time," Vate said. "I looked at it and categorized it as a well-meaning personal letter with no academic relevance. I was wrong about what was academic." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to navigate places that haven't been mapped yet, Ms. Chen. That's what the Track 1 placement actually means. The routes we send those students on are routes we don't fully understand. They go into uncertainty and they come back with data, and the data becomes the chart." He looked at her. "You will be very good at that." She thought about the full immersion simulation room, the 4 hours and the extra hour, and 43 minutes of just running routes, because the work felt like flying. She thought about her father's hands on a boot sole. She thought about a 7-year-old pressing her nose to cold glass watching violet fire in the dark. "I know," she said, and she watched the sky change color, and she felt the particular weight of everything that was coming, the hard work, the harder problems, the routes nobody had run yet. And she felt it the way her bones felt gravity. Not as burden, not as obstacle, but as the medium she moved through, the condition that had made her what she was. She thought about the acceptance notification, the moment she'd read it 3 times, the workshop smell. She thought about what it had taken to get from there to here, and the thought was not triumphant. It wasn't the shape of a victory, with a clear before and a clear after. It was more like looking at a route you'd navigated and seeing, now that you were through it, the decisions that had been decisions rather than instincts. The moment she decided not to file the report about breath, which had been a decision and also an instinct and also a calculation. The moment she'd gone into the maintenance crawl space with 89 degrees of ambient heat, and a sen making the clicking sound that meant running out of time, which had not been a decision at all, which had simply happened the way things that are completely consistent with everything you are simply happen. She was different here than she would have been at home, and also entirely herself. The academy had not made her, but it had put pressure on the shape of what she was in the way that gravity puts pressure on matter, not creating the structure but revealing it, clarifying it, making visible what was already present in the material. Her father would understand this. She knew exactly how he would nod at it, the specific quality of the nod that meant, yes, that is the right way to say it. She had his hands. She had his patience. She had his way of starting from the beginning and working toward the answer, not from the assumption outward. She had the bone density and the vestibular stability and the cardiovascular reserve that her world had put into her before she was born. She had, she thought, exactly what she needed for exactly the place she was going. She finished her noodles. She called her father. She said, "Track 1. He said, "Tell me." She did. Outside, the sky of Veth Prime went dark in the way alien skies go dark. Not like Earth dark, not like home, but dark in its own honest way. And through the viewport the first stars were appearing, and they were very far away and very bright, and she knew the routes to some of them already and would know more of them before long. She was going to go there. She had always been going to go there. All it had ever taken was not stopping.